one way of meeting the demands for hyper-personalized interaction is obviously AI, but another way of doing it is through community. And so my other big bet for 2026 and beyond is not only would AI agents become the interface, but on the other side, it's also going to be very much around human to human learning within the form of community. My question is, how are you making sure your learning is relevant and aligned to the business? Over 60% of people would stay almost 3 years longer in a company if they're able to do a lateral move. Given we're living in an era of exponential change, no organization can afford to relearn the things they once knew. There's not even enough time to learn the things you need to learn to be able to keep up.
This is how we learn now.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, Forsaven, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.
If you were given advice to new L&D leaders then, and they were just completely starting out fresh, like, what would be the one thing that you would really tell them, this is the way to go, this is the priority you need to future-proof your strategy?
Yeah, I got to lean back on, I wrote a book called Learning at Speed. And
I'm a big fan.
And yeah, in the book, I talk with the core idea of it is we're living through an era of exponential change. And quite often we underestimate exponential change, right? Like we can't comprehend how fast exponential change is. And what happens when there's exponential changes, there's typically a lot of uncertainty. And when there's uncertainty, a couple of things can happen. There's a lot of threats, but there's also a lot of opportunities. And what you tend to find is the fastest learners amongst us, that could be individuals as well as organizations, they'll be able to figure out how to navigate this uncertainty, seize the opportunities, avoid the threats, and they will win, right? The slowest learners will fall behind, struggle to keep up within this uncertainty and exponential change, and fundamentally, they'll fall back too far that you go bust. So as an individual, that means you lose your job and you're no longer competitive in the job market. For an organization, that can mean you're getting bust, right? And so the key principle of that is, as an organization, the only sustainable competitive advantage for you is the speed at which you learn, right? How do you make sure you're continuously learning at speed? And in order to be able to do that, you've got no time for learning for the sake of learning. This idea of dumping a bunch of content and telling people to do stuff for the sake of doing it without actually knowing what skills it's moving, like what's the business priority here, what's the objective it's trying to drive. No one's got time for that, right? Learning at speed is not about doing everything faster. It's about cutting the waste. And waste is anything that doesn't connect the dots between learning skills and business performance is waste, right? It's a waste of time, it's a waste of resources. And so really going back to that, how are you going to connect these dots? What are the pieces you need to put into place to be able to do that? And that, more than anything, is a mindset shift, right? That you first, as the L&D professional, needs to go, look, I'm not here to just tick a box or push out content. I'm here to drive strategic change, right? And if I want the rest of the business to respect me as someone who's bringing value to the table, then I've got to change the way I'm talking about it, right? And that's the next thing I'd say is, to be able to speak business, you got to understand business. So you got to understand what the priority of the business is and align what you're doing to support that mission, strategy, and objectives.
I think if you cut the waste, you're probably going to get people more excited about learning as well, because let's be honest, no one wants to do that training because they're forced to do it. They want to do what they're passionate about, and when you actually do learning that you enjoy, you do lose track of time because that's what you've chosen to do.
And it also creates a positive feedback loop, right? What happens is that's why self-directed learning, when you get it right, it works. It's because self-directed learning works because I've got a problem. I went looking for something to solve that problem, like a learning resource, and that learning
Like
resource could
TikTok.
be, like TikTok, a podcast, a blog. I find it actually resonates and solves that particular problem for
Yeah.
me, and then I apply it because it's the relevant learning resource. So I apply it, and when I apply it, I see the positive results of applying it, and when I see the positive results, that creates a positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
And because I've experienced that loop, I'm now more likely to keep going back to content and searching for it. And that self-directed learning starts to turn into a way in which I learn. And that's the key, where when you don't have that positive feedback loop, you find yourself having to force people to learn and push people to learn.
Yeah.
And if you're having to do that, means they've not seen that positive feedback loop.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And then just to add to that as well, is you're building a culture, but you also have to build a culture where people are not afraid to fail, because when you are learning, you might try stuff that doesn't necessarily work. So how can L&D leaders encourage people to apply what they're learning without feeling like, oh, if it doesn't go so well, I'm going to get in trouble? Or how do we encourage that?
Yeah, and I think this is the problem that stems from thinking about content without context, right? Where just pushing out content without taking into account the context of the organization, right? Do you have the psychological safety in your team to be able to someone to learn something and come back and try it, make a mistake without feeling like their manager is going to screw at them for what they did? Instead, they'll get coached and feedback around how could they done that better, right? That's one example of taking into account what's the organizational culture, what's like the dynamic between manager and their direct reports, what is the organization's strategy and mission. All of these things play into context. And I think what happens is when you overlook that, it's a bit like having fish out of water, right? Fish out of water is not going to last that long. And I think that's what content out of context is. And you're not able to connect the dots in a way where it is relevant and meaningful to that person.
Okay, so in 5 years' time, what do you think will differentiate the organisations that succeed in talent development and skills building from those that are falling behind today?
I think in summarises what we've discussed so far is they've switched from being very content focused and content first to a more kind of skills first, where they're focused on how do we build core capabilities within our organisation, and they're looking at L&D not as a cost center and just around operationalizing compliance, but actually they're looking at it as a strategic lever. Right? One of my favorite management books of all time is High Output Management by Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel. And it's a massive book, but it's a very practical book about management, and it looks at learning and training as a high leverage activity, because as a manager, I could do it for you, but it's not massively scalable, or I can teach you and coach you, and then that amplifies that knowledge and skill amongst my team, and it's a high leverage activity, right? It's like going slow to go fast. I put that time in up front.
It's an investment.
And then it's that investment, and you eat what you sow, right? And that kind of amplifies itself. And I think that understanding that key piece, and this is not a additional thing you have to do, but it's a core part of how you drive performance in your organization. And that does mean L&D in your organization probably needs a rebrand, right? You need to look at it different. You need to think about it as a strategic lever. But I think the companies that will be the most successful today and over the next 5 years will have shifted their approach. And I think the reality is, in any organization where you've currently got an L&D department which is primarily focused on operationalizing compliance, there won't be a need for it in 5 years' time. If AI can operate at a PhD level person, it can sure as hell distribute and track compliance progress. And so if that's what you're doing as an L&D department, then I think it's going to be hard times ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it is definitely easier said than done, because not everyone is going to be ready for adopting a skills-based approach. But what advice would you give to those organisations that need to start dabbling with it so that they don't fall behind and they can be seen as a business enabler?
I think the first thing is, when people sometimes think skills-based, they think, I call it the capital S, right? I'm going to become a skills-based organization overnight. I'm not talking about SPOs now. To become a skills-based organization, that is not an overnight transformation. And it's you can argue whether you need that or not. What I'm talking about is not becoming an SBO. I'm actually talking about skills with a little s, right? Skills with a little s is around what skills does this person need to do their job well today and to be job ready?
Yeah.
And what skills do they need to be able to progress to the next job they want to do in their career? That's skills with a little s. That doesn't require an end-to-end skills-based organization. That means you need to know what skills people have and what skills they need. It means your learning ecosystem needs to be mapped to the same skills language, right? To be able to connect those dots, you need to be able to go, okay, this podcast and this coaching session and this course, these are the skills and proficiency levels they can contribute to. And this person here needs those skills and proficiency levels. And quite simply, that tells you, okay, this is the most relevant learning resources for this particular person right now. And in order to achieve that, to make learning relevant, to make it meaningful, and to be able to report back on what skills you were able to grow as a result of the learning you offered, that doesn't require you to be an SBO. That just requires you to adopt skills with a little s. And adopting skills with a little s is far easier to do. And again, leveraging the right tools and AI, it's a very light lift for you as an L&D team. And so I think that's the clear differentiation people need to think about, right? Is rather than thinking, oh, this is a big transformation. No, it isn't. It's skills with a little s. And without skills with a little s, my question is, how are you making sure your learning is relevant and aligned to the business? Because if it's not, then all the problems we mentioned around low engagement and low ROI and retention. I think there's a big one here around retention where it's incredible, where a statistic came out, I think this was with LinkedIn, that said over 60% of people would stay almost 3 years longer in a company if they were able to do a lateral move.
Yeah.
And that's a big change from the traditional model of career growth and retention, right? Like career growth was always, I go up, one day I'll become a manager. This isn't that. This is more about a skills-based talent mobility. We're going, okay, I've got 70% of a skills match for another role in a different job family. That's a lateral move. More and more people, especially Gen Z, don't want to become managers, right? Like they want to be individual contributors, but they still want to grow. To be able to support that world of work, you need to be able to adopt skills with a little s to be able to drive that.
Definitely. I definitely agree. And I think even with how companies hire people, they're looking for the right skills now. That's more important than even academic results and grades. And that's something I read in the news quite recently. So I don't know if you agree with that from a hiring perspective as well as a retention perspective.
For sure. I think we lean on degrees and formal qualifications that came from school and universities because of a lack of an effective way of measuring your ability and capabilities today. If we had an effective way of measuring and tracking your skills today, we wouldn't need to lean on a degree.
Yeah.
The fact that
There we go, new business idea for us.
but that's the way it will go, right? And so I think it's unsurprising because by the time you finish a 3-year, 4-year degree, a lot of that curriculum might be out of touch when you've got exponential change. You've got you're not changing curriculum between ChatGPT 3 and ChatGPT 5.
No.
And so how can your curriculum keep up to date, right? And I think that's where the problem is.
Yeah, no, again, just going back to that university example we were talking about earlier, by the time something is baked into a curriculum, it is so outdated that it is so hard for like uni students even just to keep up with that. And that's why the world of work does feel like a little bit of a shock because it doesn't really connect back to what actually happens in reality. But that being said, you have been in the space for quite some time. So I'm really curious to know, what do you think is going to be like the big shifts and trends in 2026?
In 2026, I think AI agents will become the interface for how we work, right? Which means from an L&D perspective, the days of having a single portal and trying to drive everyone to a single tool or app for all of their learning, that's not going to happen, right? It's the agent where I'm going to go to, whether it's for my learning or asking questions or getting tasks done, and essentially building your learning experiences for effective delivery within the agent world. I think it's going to be a big piece. Now, it's not just about AI. Going back to my previous point around how we're going to have a very low tolerance for passive interaction for anything that's generic. Now, one way of meeting the demands for hyper-personalized interaction is obviously AI, but another way of doing it is through community. Community and scaling that one-to-one, that many-to-many connection that comes in a community is a great way of being contextually aware and personalizing the knowledge sharing and the learning experience. But also it brings you something that AI can't bring, which is a sense of belonging within a community or an organization. And so my other big bet for 2026 and beyond is not only would AI agents become the interface, but on the other side, it's also going to be very much around human to human learning within the form of community. And so I think it will drive up both the human to human experience as well as AI being the kind of interface for us discovering and engaging with learning.
I'm really glad you mentioned about the humans because at least we're not going to be all losing our jobs. But I think it's like even sometimes we forget that there are experts within our business as well, and that we can and should be leaning into them more. And sometimes with remote work, for example, it can be difficult to know who to reach out to, especially in large organizations. So I think that community piece is really interesting. Do you think companies lean into that enough?
Probably not, because I think in most cases, again, going back to do you know what skills you have in the business? If you don't know what expertise and skills and capabilities you have in the organization, how do you know who to go to? That's why one of my favorite features in How Now, and I know a lot of organizations we work with love, is we have something called expert search, right? So because we map everyone's skills and we measure what skills they're an expert in, the next time you search for VLOOKUP, right, like how to do a VLOOKUP, instead of giving you a 5-hour Excel course, instead I can show you, here's so-and-so in the organization who's an Excel whiz, and then connect you with them. And you can then connect with them, Slack teams directly via How Now, and you can ask them instead. And so it's not just about thinking around your learning ecosystem is not just courses, right? It's very diverse and rich. And alongside all of that formal and informal learning, you've got people, those internal subject matter experts who can answer those questions, coach people, mentor people. And we really want to build and lean on this idea of human-powered learning.
I definitely agree with that. And I think there's also like a piece in there about actual knowledge sharing as well. So if that expert was, for example, to leave the organization, that is a big chunk of knowledge that's leaving with them. So actually even being able to have knowledge flow more freely within the organization really helps retain that and create more seamless experiences within and outside the company as well.
For sure. And this is what we call a leaky bucket problem, right? Like you get someone in the organization, they've been there for 5 years, they learn a ton of great stuff, and then when they leave, all of that good stuff leaves with them, right? And given we're living in an era of exponential change, no organization can afford to relearn the things they once knew. There's not even enough time to learn the things you need to learn to be able to keep up. And so it's really important to be able to plug those leaky buckets.
Definitely, especially now that I think people are leaving organizations within 12 to 24 months. That definitely makes sense. Well, Nelson, thank you so much for sharing your predictions. You managed to...
I survived.
You survived. Hopefully it wasn't too much of a grilling, but I really enjoyed hearing your perspective. So I'll definitely be tuning into the next one. And thank you again for sharing your predictions. I'll be also staying around to see if they come true. So I'll grow again the same time next year.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks, Nelson.
This is how we learn now.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by How Now, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use How Now to connect your people to the skills they need, deliver learning in the flow of work, and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, So Energy, Forsaven, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.